The candles in the great hall of Marlstone had burned to their last inch by the time she found the pattern, and it was the smell that struck her first. Tallow gone bitter, and beneath it, faintly, the dust of a room too long shut against use. 12 servants stood arranged along the wall like witnesses at an inquest, and perhaps they were. The green ledger lay open on the table before her, its calf leather soft with handling that had stopped exactly 1 year ago, its pages a thicket of symbols no one living had troubled to read. She had read them. "You will explain," the Duke said, "or you will leave this house tonight, in the rain, with whatever you can carry." He did not raise his voice. He never did. It was a thing she had noticed about him within her first hour at Marlstone, that cruelty, delivered quietly, wounds in a different place than cruelty shouted. "The mark here," she said, touching a small crescent beside a column of figures, "is not an amount, Your Grace. It is a season. Your mother did not record what was spent. She recorded what the house needed against what the year could give it. This crescent means winter wheat, held back. This one beneath it means the tenant at Fenning's Cross paid late and was not made to feel it." No one in the hall spoke. The old butler, who had stood at the dowager's shoulder for 41 years and had not seen this ledger open since her death, allowed himself the smallest exhale, not quite a breath of relief, but its cousin. The Duke's face did not change, though something behind it seemed to recalculate. "And how," he said, "does a bookkeeper's daughter come to read my mother's private hand?" "The same way I read my father's," she answered, slowly, and because someone had to. It was, she understood even as she said it, the wrong kind of honesty for a woman standing 3 feet from the door that might yet be closed against her. She was 26, plainly dressed in wool gone thin at the elbow, and she owed this man, or rather, the paper he had purchased from a moneylender in Aldrich 3 weeks past, the sum of £412, a debt not her own making, but her father's, inherited the way one inherits weather. She had not asked to be brought to Marlstone. She had been brought as one brings in a debtor's furniture, to be catalogued and disposed of at leisure. She had not known, when the Duke's man came for her in November, that this ledger existed, or that its neglect had been eating quietly at the house for a full year. The way damp eats at a beam no one thinks to inspect until it gives way beneath a careless foot. She knew it now. The Duke looked at the crescent mark a long moment, then closed the ledger himself, gently, for a man who had just threatened to turn her into the weather. "Begin tomorrow," he said, "at 6. She had expected 6 to mean 6, and it did, though nothing else about the house obeyed the hour so exactly. The kitchen fire was already lit when she came down the back stair, her breath still visible in the passage, and the old butler was standing at the servants' table, with a candle stub burned to its last inch, as though he had been waiting there since before light. He did not greet her. He set before her a tray of correspondence gone yellow at the folds, 3 years of unopened tradesmen's bills, and a look that told her nothing of what he thought, though she would learn, in time, that his silences carried more particular meaning than most men's speeches. "You'll want a fire in the small study," he said. Her Grace kept it lit, even in August. Said cold ink lies. It was the first kindness offered her at Marlstone, if it could be called kindness. A fact about a dead woman's habits, delivered without warmth, and yet it was more than the Duke had given her, more than the housekeeper who eyed her wool-thin sleeve with open contempt, more than the footman who had not troubled to learn whether she took her tea with milk. She had arrived in November with one traveling case, and her father's own dip pen wrapped in a stocking, because a bookkeeper's daughter does not trust another man's pen to write true, and she had spent 3 weeks since sleeping in the room above the laundry and being spoken to, when spoken to at all, as one speaks to a hired mule, necessary, replaceable, faintly resented for its cost. She had not asked why the Duke wanted her broken, rather than simply dismissed, with the debt hanging over her father's grave, like a debt hangs over any dead man's grave, unpaid and unpayable by the dead. She had her suspicions. She had heard the name of his younger brother spoken once, sharply, by the housekeeper, and had watched the Duke's face when it was said, and had filed the observation away the way she filed every column that did not balance, not solved, only noted, awaiting the entry that would explain it. Now she sat before the green ledger in the cold study, with its newly lit fire not yet warming the far corner, and opened it to the page where the dowager's hand had stopped a year ago, mid-entry, the ink slightly heavier there, as though the pen had pressed down, while its holder thought of something else, or felt something coming. She did not know yet what that unfinished line concerned. She knew only that it was wrong by 3 shillings 4 pence, and that no one in this house had noticed, or had wished to. She reached for her father's pen. It was her father's habit, learned from his own father before him, to correct an error not by striking through it, but by carrying it forward, so that the mistake remained visible and the truth walked beside it, honest about its own correction. She did this now, in the margin, in a hand smaller and plainer than the dowager's looping script, and felt the old satisfaction of a column that would, in a moment, agree with itself. The 3 shillings and 4 pence resolved themselves into a payment to a chandler in Aldrich, dated the 11th of December, a year and 11 days past, a purchase of beeswax candles for the chapel that someone had recorded twice and paid for once, or paid for twice and recorded once. She could not yet say which, only that the discrepancy had sat unmourned in this book for a year, while the house burned its candles and buried its duchess, and never once looked back to see that the numbers had stopped speaking the truth. She heard the door before she heard him. The old butler had a way of announcing arrivals with the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard from the threshold, a signal she suspected he had never once mentioned aloud to anyone, least of all the man it most concerned. "You are still at it," the Duke said, from the doorway. "Not quite a question." "The wax account did not balance," she said, without looking up. "It does now." He came further into the room, and she was aware of him, the way one is aware of weather, a change in pressure rather than a sight. He stood over the desk and looked down at the page, at her father's careful method of correction laid bare beside the dowager's original error, and something in his face, she saw it only sidelong, in the reflection off the inkwell's silver rim, moved, and stilled again before it could be named. "My mother kept that chandler's bill in her head for 30 years, he said. "She never wrote it down wrong before." "She did not write it down wrong," the bookkeeper's daughter said. "She wrote it down twice, in 2 different moods, on 2 different days, and no one told her the difference, because no one else could read the page well enough to tell her anything at all." He did not answer this. He looked, instead, at the unfinished line above it, the one where the ink pressed heavy, where the pen had paused mid-thought a year ago and never finished the thought at all, and his jaw did something small and controlled, the kind of motion a man makes when he has trained himself for years not to make it in front of servants. "Leave that entry," he said finally. "Whatever it says. Leave it as she left it." "I intend to," she said. "I am only reading it. Not everything broken wants mending by strangers." He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since he had entered, as one might look at a lock one had assumed rusted shut, only to hear, faintly, from somewhere deep inside it, the small definite click of a mechanism still willing to turn. He withdrew his hand from the desk's edge, as though he had not realized he had placed it there, and for a moment the room held only the small sounds a house makes when it is cold, and has been cold a long time, the settling of coal in the grate, the tick of a clock in the passage that no one had wound correctly in a year. The old butler, who had stood by the door through the whole of it, with the particular stillness of a man pretending not to listen, allowed himself the smallest movement of the eyes toward the ledger, then toward her, then toward nothing at all. "You will want a fire in here," the Duke said at last, and it was not quite an apology, though it traveled in that direction the way a badly aimed letter still sometimes finds its house. "The ink freezes." "It has already frozen twice," she said. "I thought it with my own breath on Tuesday, which is not a method I recommend to anyone with better sense than I have." Something crossed his face that was almost, though he would have denied it under oath, amusement, and was gone again before it could be named. He turned to go, and stopped at the door, his hand on the frame in the same unconscious way it had touched the desk. "The steward's daughter," he said, without turning round. "The one who cracked her ledgers. She could not have been much older than you are now." "She was 36 when she began this book," the old butler said quietly, the first words he had offered unbidden in the whole exchange. "I remember, your grace, because it was the year of the hard frost, and her ladyship said the cold made her handwriting honest." The Duke did not answer this either. He left, and the door did not slam, which she noted. She had begun, without quite intending to, keeping a private ledger of the things he did not do, did not raise his voice, did not dismiss her twice in the same week, did not take back the fire he had promised, once granted. That night the fire came, unannounced, carried in by a housemaid who would not meet her eye, and left again without a word, as though warmth itself were a thing that must be smuggled rather than given. She sat with the green ledger open on her knees, and the coals throwing small orange light across the dowager's ruined, doubled entries, and thought, not for the first time, that a house could keep a woman's grief the way a book kept her arithmetic, badly, if no one taught it how, and for years after she was gone. She turned the page. The next entry was in a third hand, cramped and unfamiliar, dated the week of the dowager's death, and it did not match anything that had come before it. Not her ledger mood, not her ink, not even, she thought, tracing the loop of a letter, with one cold finger, her intention. The hand was not the housekeeper's, that much she knew within a minute, for the housekeeper's letters ran narrow and upright, disciplined as a soldier's march, and this hand sprawled, its downstrokes heavy, its abbreviations wrong, in a way that suggested haste, or grief, rather than ignorance. Someone who knew the code had tried to use it and failed. She held the ledger closer to the coals. The entry recorded a sum, £11 6 against a symbol she had seen only twice before, both times beside purchases of medicine from the Aldrich apothecary. But the date was wrong. The dowager had been dead 4 days by then. She sat with that wrongness a long while, the fire guttering low, until the shape of it settled into something like an accusation she did not yet wish to make. Someone had gone on writing in the old woman's book, after she could no longer speak, to correct them. Someone had tried, clumsily, to close an account they did not understand, in the days between a death and a funeral, when a house is at its most unwatched. In the morning she brought the page to the butler, not the Duke. She had learned by now which doors opened and which merely creaked, and watched his face do the slow, careful work of a man deciding how much to know. He turned the ledger toward the window light, held it at the distance his eyes required these days, and was silent long enough that she counted 8 beats of the mantel clock. "That is Mr. Hallow's hand," he said at last, made to look otherwise. Hallow had been the old steward, dead himself now these 8 months, the very man to whom her father's debt had first been owed, before it passed, like an unkind inheritance, into the money-lender's ledger, and thence into the Duke's. She felt the coincidence settle over her like cold water finding a crack in a boot. "Why would a dying man forge a dead woman's hand?" she said. "Over £11 6 The butler did not answer at once. He closed the ledger with the particular gentleness of a man closing a coffin lid, and said only that some debts were owed forward and some were owed back, and that the house had more of the second kind than anyone still living cared to count. Then he asked her, in the mild tone he used for weather and mealtimes, not to mention the page to his grace until she understood it better than he did. She agreed, though she was not certain, watching him carry the ledger away under his arm like something that might yet bite him. That understanding was a thing this house intended to permit her. She did not go directly to the accounts room after that, though her hands wanted the familiar weight of the pen the way a cold body wants a fire. Instead, she stood a moment in the passage where the light came gray and thin through a window not yet cleaned of December's grime, and turned the butler's phrase over, as one turns a coin to find the mint mark. Some debts were owed forward and some were owed back. She thought of her father's ledger, kept in his own crabbed hand at the kitchen table by candle stub, every entry squared before he'd allow himself supper, and she thought that he, at least, had never let a debt run in either direction without a name attached to it. The £11 6 troubled her more than the sum warranted. It was too small a thing to forge, and too small a thing to forget, the kind of figure that belonged to a widow's charity, or a debt of honor between two people who had once trusted each other and no longer needed to write down why. She did not mention it to his grace. She had given her word, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant to keep it, not from fear of him, but from a private, stubborn wish not to hand him a mystery half solved, as though he were a man who deserved her whole labor or none of it. The days that followed were quiet in the particular way of a house holding its breath. The Duke took his dinners in the library and left the accounts room door ajar, which she understood, without being told, as a kind of permission rather than an oversight. The old housekeeper's ghost, for so the staff called the Green Ledger's habits, half in jest, half in genuine unease, seemed to watch from every column she balanced, every abbreviation she resolved. She found, 3 pages further on, another entry in that same faint, wrong-shaped hand. A payment of £4 to a Mrs. Aldous, deceased these 6 years, dated the week before the dowager's death. It was the butler who told her, unbidden, over the ironing of the Duke's linen one grey afternoon, that Mrs. Aldous had been Hallow's sister. He said it without looking up, the way a man drops a stone into still water to see how far the rings will travel before something below stirs. She did not ask him to say more. She only wrote the name down in her own hand, in the margin, in plain English rather than the dowager's private code. A small act of defiance, or perhaps of mercy, she could not yet say which, and closed the ledger for the night with the sense that she was no longer merely balancing a dead woman's accounts, but reading, entry by entry, the shape of a debt that had outlived everyone who understood its true terms. The name sat in the margin like a splinter under skin, and she found she could not pass the page without her eye catching on it, the way one cannot help pressing a bruise to learn if it still aches. She had meant, when she wrote it, only to mark a fact, a small correction against the dowager's habit of disguising even the dead in symbols, but by the 3rd morning she understood she had also planted a question, and that the household, in its quiet way, had begun to watch her tend it. The Duke did not ask what she had found. He had taken, since the reading of the ledger before the assembled staff, to appearing in the study doorway at odd hours, saying nothing, watching the fire more than her hands, as though he could not decide whether his presence there was inspection or something less easily named. On the 4th evening he came in with snow still unmelted on his shoulders, and stood a long moment before he said, not quite carelessly, "You have been slow on the household accounts this week." "I have been thorough," she said, not looking up. "Those are rarely the same thing." "In your mother's book," she said. "They were." He said nothing to that, but he did not leave, either, and she felt his stillness behind her, the way one feels weather changing before it arrives, a pressure at the back of the neck, not yet rain. It was the butler who broke the matter open, 3 days later, over the polishing of the Duke's boots, a task he performed himself, though there were footmen enough for it, out of some old loyalty she had not yet learned the shape of. "Hallow was steward here," he said, "before your father's time, before the old Duke's even. Land agent for 30 years. Went off sudden. No pension, no word. The winter the young master—" He stopped, the cloth going still on the leather. "The winter the young master was born. The dowager kept paying his sister after, quiet-like. Never told the estate why. And the debt," she said, "the £412. Was it Hallow's?" The butler looked at her then, properly, for the first time in weeks, and something in his face suggested she had asked the wrong question, or perhaps the only right one asked in the wrong order. "No," he said slowly, "but I begin to wonder, miss, whether it was made to look like it wasn't." He said no more, and resumed his polishing, and she understood that she had been given not an answer, but a door, and that behind it was something the old woman's code had been built, in part, to keep shut, something that had outlasted the dowager and the steward, and very nearly outlasted the truth itself, waiting only for a hand patient enough and unafraid enough to open the last page. She sat that night with the ledger open past the pages she had already resolved, past the tidy columns of coal and candle wax and butcher's bills, into a section she had avoided because it did not balance, and because the dowager's hand there had grown small and cramped, as though written in haste or in fear of being read. The symbol appeared 11 times across 4 years, a little cross, barred twice, unlike any other mark in the book. Beside it, always the same phantom entry, an amount paid out, never an amount received, never a name spelled in full. H. Quarterly, per instruction. She had learned by now that the dowager wrote nothing without reason and hid nothing without cause, and that the two were rarely at odds. She copied the 11 entries onto a fresh sheet, dates in one column, sums in another, and saw at once what the code had been built to conceal, from a glance but not from patience. The payments did not cease with any death she could find recorded. They continued past the year. The old land agent was said to have gone off sudden. They continued, in fact, almost to the month the dowager herself had died, as though the debt, whatever it truly was, had outlived the woman who paid it, and had simply stopped, unfinished, when the hand that wrote the checks stopped moving. She thought of the £412 sitting in the moneylender's paper in Aldrich, sold once, bought once, and wondered, not idly now, but with the particular coldness of a bookkeeper's daughter finding an error too neat to be an accident, whether her father's debt had been drawn from the same well as this one, whether the sum had been chosen, not calculated, whether someone, at some point, had needed a number that looked like ruin and was in fact a door closed on something else entirely. She did not go to the Duke with it, not yet. She had learned enough of his house, and of him, to know that a suspicion offered too soon was a suspicion given a chance to be denied before it had finished growing. Instead, she went to the housekeeper's old accounts, kept separate from the dowager's, dustier, less loved, and found, 3 pages in, a single line that made her set down the candle rather than risk it shaking in her hand. Wages, H, settled in full, per her grace, not to be entered above. Not to be entered above, as though the ledger itself had 2 floors, one for the household to see, and one beneath it, where the true accounts were kept from everyone but the woman who wrote them, and, perhaps, one other person still living. She thought of the butler's face when she had asked her question in the wrong order. She thought that she would need to ask him another, and soon, before the house grew any colder, and before whoever had built this debt to look like her father's discovered that someone had finally learned to read beneath it. She found him in the boot room, of all places, oiling a bridle that had not been used since the old Duke's day, working the leather with the particular slowness of a man who wished to be found doing something ordinary. She did not sit. She had learned that much, that questions asked while standing were questions that could be answered plainly, and questions asked while seated invited the kind of long, evasive comfort that men of his age and service had perfected over decades. Wages, H, she said. Settled in full, per her grace, not to be entered above. His hands stilled on the leather, though his face did not change, which told her more than any start would have. You've a fine eye, he said, for other people's business. It is my business now. You made it so, the day you handed me the green ledger and told me it wanted mending. She let the silence sit a moment before adding, more gently than she felt, Who is H? He set the bridle down with the care of a man setting down something that might otherwise be thrown. There was a groundsman, Hardacre, left the estate near enough 2 years before her grace passed, over a dispute about wages he claimed were owed him, and the steward claimed were not. He paused. Her grace settled it herself, quiet, out of her own purse, and told the steward to keep it from the main book. Didn't want the trustees asking why a groundsman's grievance was worth more attention than his position. And the steward, she said, was the same man who held my father's debt. The same, the butler said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not surprise, but the relief of a man finally permitted to say a thing he had carried alone. I'll not tell you he was an honest man, miss, for he was not, though his grace's father trusted him past all sense. But I'll not tell you he was a thief outright either, only that he kept 2 sets of hands for 2 sets of books, and her grace knew it, and let it stand so long as her own accounts stayed clean of it. And my father's £412. I could not say, the butler said, and for the first time in all their exchanges, he looked at her the way a man looks at weather he cannot read, but I'd not swear it was owed the way it was written down. She thanked him, because thanking him cost nothing, and might buy his continued help, and she went back up through the cold passage with the candle, guttering low in its stub, thinking that a debt built to look like her father's shame might yet prove to be someone else's theft, and that the Duke, who had bought that debt to humble her, might one day have to reckon with what, exactly, he had purchased. She did not sleep that night, though she lay still enough to be counted among the sleeping. The candle stub burned itself out sometime before 3, and she let it, lying in the dark with the shape of the steward's words turning over and over, like a coin held up to a light, too poor to show its face. 2 sets of hands for 2 sets of books. She had learned her letters at her father's knee, precisely so that no one could ever say such a thing of him and have her unable to answer it. Now, the accusation stood unanswered, because the man who might answer it was 8 months dead, and the woman who might have known the truth of it was a year in the ground at Marlstone's edge, under a stone the Duke had chosen and never once, so far as the servants said, gone to visit. In the morning she asked for the strong-room key and was refused it, as she had expected to be. She asked instead, through the housekeeper, who asked it as though the idea were her own, for the old steward's correspondence, 4 years of it, kept in a deed box in the estate office that no one had opened since the funeral. This was granted, with the indifference of a man granting a child a broken toy to keep her quiet. She read by window light, because candles were rationed to her as to no one else in the house, and she read slowly, the way her father had taught her to read a column of figures, not for the sum, but for the seam, the place where 2 hands had joined and did not quite match. She found the seam on the 9th day, a payment recorded to a Wiltshire bookkeeper in the sum of £390, entered in the steward's clean copy, and no trace of it at all in the dowager's green ledger, where every payment out of the estate, however small, had been noted in her tight, coded hand. £390, unaccounted for on one side and unrecorded on the other, in the very year her father's own debts had begun their slow climb toward ruin. She sat with the paper a long while before she folded it and put it inside her bodice, against her ribs, where it would stay dry and stay hers. She thought of showing the butler, and did not. She thought of confronting the Duke with it across his own desk, and did not do that either, for she understood, with the same cold clarity she brought to a column of figures, that a woman who accused a dead steward of theft, in a house that had bought her father's debt to shame her, would be believed only as far as it suited the man who held the paper, and not 1 farthing further. So she said nothing, and kept the paper, and waited for the ledger itself to tell her what the steward's letters could only suggest. The house did not pause for her discovery. It went on, as houses do, indifferent to the weight a woman carries against her ribs, and she went on with it, rising before the frost had thinned on the scullery window, laying fires, counting linen, entering sums in her own clean hand, beside the dowager's older ones, as though £390 had not lodged itself somewhere beneath her collarbone like a second heartbeat. She began, in the evenings, to work backward through the year before her father's ruin. Not the steward's clean copy, that told her only what he wished told, but the green ledger itself, page by coded page, matching dates against dates, until the candle guttered low, and the butler, passing with his lamp, would find her still at the study table and say nothing beyond a nod, though once he set down beside her a cup of tea, gone lukewarm from waiting, and did not explain why he had brought it. She found the pattern on a Tuesday, in a hand of rain against the windows loud enough to cover the scratch of her pen, small sums, quarterly, marked only with the dowager's private symbol for household sundries, a symbol that elsewhere in the ledger meant candles, meant soap, meant the ordinary small mercies of running a house, but which here recurred in amounts too large for soap, too regular for accident, always in the weeks nearest to quarter day, when the steward himself rode into Aldrich to settle the estate's accounts with the very moneylender who had, in time, come to hold her father's paper. She did not weep over it. She had long since learned that grief and arithmetic did not share a table well, and she wanted her mind clear for what came after. She copied the dates onto a separate slip, in her own hand, and held both papers, the steward's letter and her own reckoning, together for a long moment before returning them to their hiding place. It was the butler who noticed the change first, not in her work, which remained exact, but in the particular stillness that had come over her, the way she now watched the Duke across the breakfast table with something sharper than deference. He said nothing of it to his master, He had served this house 41 years and had learned that a woman with a secret worth keeping generally knew better than he did when to spend it. The Duke noticed only that she had grown quieter, and, being a man unaccustomed to reading silence as anything but sullenness, mistook it for the beginning of surrender. He did not know, could not yet know, that the ledger he had bought to humble her was, page by patient page, teaching her exactly how his mother's house, and his own inheritance, had been quietly bled for years by a man he had trusted absolutely, and buried with full honors the spring before. The frost had come early that year, sharpening the edges of the gravel walks until they rang beneath a boot like struck glass, and it was on such a morning, breath fogging over the open ledger, that she found the second entry to match the first. Not the same hand. The steward had been careful to vary his script when the sums grew larger, but the same pattern beneath it, like a watermark held to candlelight, a purchase of seed grain recorded twice, once in the estate accounts and once, at a slightly lower figure, in the tenant receipts, the difference vanishing into no pocket she could yet name. She did not gasp. She had learned, in 8 months of this house, that a gasp was a luxury afforded to women who did not need their positions, and she needed hers still. 412 pounds worth of needing, though the number had begun, of late, to feel less like a chain than a measure, of time past, of debt narrowing, of something else she had not yet permitted herself to call by name. She brought the discrepancy to the butler in the pantry, where the good silver was kept wrapped in green baize, and the air smelled of vinegar and beeswax, and he studied the 2 entries with the particular patience of a man who had buried more secrets in this house than he had ever unearthed. "He was 30 years in this family's confidence," the butler said at last, not looking up. "Her Grace trusted him with the keys before she trusted her own sons. Then, he was well placed to be trusted wrongly," she said. The butler did not answer that directly. Instead, he told her, in the flat voice he used for facts he had decided not to feel anything about, that the steward had died in March, of a fever, and been buried with the household in mourning black and a wreath from the Duke's own conservatory, and that no one, not the Duke, not the solicitor, not the Dowager's own sharp ghost, had anyone believed in such things, had thought to open his books before closing his grave. "Does his lordship know?" she asked. "His lordship knows what he is told," the butler said, "and he has not asked to be told this." That evening, at the long table where she still ate apart, though nearer the salt than she had once been placed, the Duke remarked, without any particular unkindness, that she had grown very silent of late, and hoped it did not signal some fresh grievance against his household. She told him only that the accounts required close attention this week, which was true, and watched him accept the answer as a man accepts weather, inconvenient, unexamined, and none of his concern to alter. He returned to his letters. She returned to her plate, and beneath the table, where no one could see it, her hand rested a moment on the fold of paper in her pocket, the steward's dates copied out in her own careful ink, waiting for the hour, not yet arrived, but coming, as certainly as the frost had come, when silence would no longer serve either of them. The frost, when it came in the night, and by morning the west lawn at Marlstone wore it like a widow's veil, delicate and thorough, silvering every blade so that the old butler, crossing to the stables before the household stirred, left the only footprints in a world otherwise unmarked. She saw this from the window of the small room, where the green ledger lived now more than in its cabinet, and thought, not for the first time, that the frost did to grass what the years had done to the Dowager's accounts, laid a fine, deceptive smoothness over what beneath was still uneven ground. The steward's dates would not leave her. 4 entries, each a small discrepancy no larger than £3, each dated within the month before the old woman's death, each in a hand that was not the Dowager's careful cipher, nor the housekeeper's plainer script, but something between, hurried, angled, made by someone unpracticed in disguising haste as habit. She had copied them twice now, once for her own record, and once, she admitted to herself only as she folded the paper smaller, in case the first copy should be lost, or taken, or made to disappear the way certain pages in certain books had a talent for disappearing, when the wrong eyes fell upon them. She did not yet know whose hand it was. She suspected, and the suspecting sat in her like a stone swallowed whole, heavy and impossible to bring up by will alone. That week, she kept to the ledger room longer than the fires warranted, and the housekeeper, passing the door twice of an evening, remarked to the butler that the girl worked as though the numbers themselves might run off if she blinked. The butler, who understood more than he permitted his face to show, said only that some debts wanted settling before the frost gave way to thaw, and left it there, as he left most things there, having learned in 41 years that a house kept its secrets on its own schedule and rarely thanked a man for hurrying it. On the Thursday, the Duke asked again, this time at breakfast, over coffee gone lukewarm in its silver pot, whether the accounts troubled her. She said they did not trouble her, they merely required patience. He looked at her a moment longer than the answer strictly required, as though some instrument in him, unused these 3 years, had registered a change in pressure without yet naming its cause, and then he returned, as he always returned, to the safety of his letters. She watched him go. The paper in her pocket had grown soft at its folds from handling, the ink beginning to blur at one corner where her thumb had rested too often, too long, weighing the cost of speaking against the greater cost, she was coming to understand, of staying silent. The frost held through that week as though the sky itself had decided to test her patience alongside the households. She rose before the scullery maids now, out of habit more than duty, and found the kitchen fire already coaxed to life by the butler's hand, who never spoke of it, and never failed to do it. In the still hour before the house woke, she opened the green ledger to the page she had been circling for 3 days without committing pen to it. An entry from November, of the year the old Duchess died, a sum paid out to no name the housekeeper's memoranda could explain, marked only with the small looped symbol the dowager had used, elsewhere in the book, for family matters too delicate to write plainly. She had shown it to no one, not the butler, whose loyalty she trusted, not the Duke, whose temper she did not yet trust enough to test with anything so combustible as a mystery touching his own house. The sum was £40, paid the same month his brother had gone abroad rather suddenly, by the housekeeper's own account, for reasons never given to the staff below. She did not know what it meant. She suspected enough to be careful. On the Friday, snow came instead of thaw, fine and dry, dusting the stable roofs and settling in the grooves of the courtyard stones, and the Duke rode out anyway, against the groom's quiet counsel, returning past dark with his collar frozen stiff, and his mood, for once, softened rather than sharpened by the cold. He found her still at the desk in the small study off the library, the candle burned to a stub, the green ledger open before her. "You keep late hours for a woman who claims patience," he said, shedding his gloves. "The hours keep me," she answered, not looking up. "I have merely stopped resisting them." He almost smiled. She saw it arrive and retreat, like a visitor changing its mind at the door, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of it. Not fear this time, but a feeling she declined to examine, the way one declines to examine a wound still too fresh to bear pressing. "You've found something," he said. It was not a question. "I have found several somethings. Most of them are yours to know eventually. Some of them are not mine to give you before I understand them myself." He studied her the way he had studied her at breakfast. That same recalibration, that same unnamed pressure shifting somewhere behind his eyes, and then, uncharacteristically, he did not press. He only nodded once, took up his own candle, and left her to the ledger and the snow ticking faintly against the glass, and she sat a long while afterward with the folded paper still in her pocket, listening to the house settle around her like something deciding, at last, whether it could be trusted to keep a secret a little longer. The paper in her pocket was 3 years old, folded so many times its creases had gone soft as cloth, and she had found it not in the green ledger, but pressed between 2 pages of household linens accounts, where no one who was not looking for arithmetic would ever think to look for grief. It was a note in the dowager's hand, not in code, unusual for that, 3 lines, addressed to no one, dated the winter before her death, concerning a sum of money set aside and never spent, and a name she did not recognize, written, and then struck through so hard the nib had torn the paper. She had read it twice, and understood perhaps a third of it, and that third had been enough to make her fold it away again, rather than carry it downstairs like a plate to be served. She did not sleep well that night, though the house was quiet in the particular way it had learned to be quiet since she had come to it. The quiet not of neglect but of order, of doors that no longer stuck, of a larder that no longer smelled of damp. She lay listening to the snow against the glass, and thought of the Duke's face arriving at a smile, and retreating from it, and told herself this was merely curiosity, the same species of attention she gave to a column that would not sum. She was aware, even as she told herself this, that it was not entirely true, and she filed the awareness away with the same discipline she gave to any figure she could not yet account for, noted, not ignored, set aside until it could be reconciled. In the morning, the old butler found her in the small room off the pantry, where the account books lived, now in their proper order, and he set down before her, without comment, a second candle stub, as if he had noticed the first was burning low, and thought it worth remedying before being asked. She thanked him. He inclined his head and did not leave immediately, which she had come to understand was his way of offering conversation, without the indignity of requesting it. "You found the note," he said at last. She looked up. "You knew of it." "I knew there was one." "Her Grace did not tell me its contents. She trusted me with locks, not with confidences of that particular kind." He straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "There are things in this house older than either of us that were never meant to be solved quickly. I would counsel patience, if you'll permit an old man the liberty." "I had not intended haste." "No," he agreed, with something almost like approval. "You never do." And he left her to the ledger, the candle, and the name struck through so violently it had nearly gone through the page, waiting, as everything in that house seemed to wait, for her to earn the right to understand it. She sat a long while with the struck-through name before her, the candle's second stub burning steadier than the first had done, and told herself that curiosity was not the same as haste. The ink beneath the violence of the strike was still legible if one held the page aslant to the light. "Somme," she thought, and then a longer word beginning with R, before the pen had gouged through in 3 furious passes, as though the dowager had wished not merely to cross the name out, but to unwrite it from the paper's memory. She copied the shape of it onto a scrap, not from disobedience to the butler's counsel, but because a bookkeeper's daughter had been taught that nothing observed once should be trusted to memory alone. She did not solve it that night. She balanced the linen accounts instead, finding a discrepancy of 4 shillings traced at last to a laundress who had been charging for starch never purchased, and she noted it in the margin in her own small hand beside the dowager's, as she had begun to do whenever her own work touched the old woman's, not to claim credit, but because it seemed to her a kind of courtesy, the way one might leave a note for someone expected home late. The following morning brought weather hard enough to crack the puddles in the stable yard, and the Duke came to the kitchen passage before breakfast, an unusual hour for him, to say only that the northern wall of the home farm's dairy had begun to weep with damp, and would want seeing to before the frost worsened it. He did not ask her opinion. He stood, in fact, some considerable while in the doorway, as if the request itself embarrassed him, and when she said she would look at the farm's accounts to see what repair had last been paid for, and by whom, he replied, "I did not ask for accounts. I asked that it be seen to," and left before she could answer, which she had come to recognize as the particular shape of his retreat when he had said something he had not entirely meant to say. She went to the farm ledger anyway. It was thinner than the house ledger, less careful, kept by a bailiff long dismissed, and in it she found, folded flat between 2 pages recording the purchase of seed corn, a second scrap of paper, brittle with age, bearing no name at all, only a date some 11 years past, and a sum of money she recognized, with a small, cold shock, as precisely half of what her father's debt had been. She sat with it a long while in the unheated farm office, her breath showing pale in the air, and did not yet know what it meant, only that it meant something, and that the house was assembling itself before her one drawer, one scrap, one struck-through name at a time, as though it had been waiting, patient as the old butler had counseled her to be, for someone willing to read it slowly enough to be trusted with the whole. She folded the scrap along its old crease, careful of the place where the paper had gone soft as cloth, and carried it back to the house rather than trust it to the farm office drawer, where damp had already begun its slow work on lesser things. The kitchen yard was empty of all but a boy scattering grain for the hens, and she went in by the scullery door, past the copper pots hung in their graduated rows, to find the butler at his small table by the pantry window, polishing the everyday silver with the unhurried attention he gave to objects no one else thought to notice. She set the scrap before him without a word. He did not touch it at once. He set down the fork he was polishing and wiped his hands on the cloth at his belt, and only then drew the paper toward him and held it to the gray light, and she watched something move behind his eyes that was not quite surprise, more the settling of a suspicion long carried and never voiced. "Half," he said at last. "Half of my father's debt, to the farthing." "I know the sum," he said, and did not explain how, and she had learned by now not to press him before he was ready, for he gave things up the way the house gave up its drawers, in his own time, in his own order. "There is a name struck through in the farm ledger," she said. "2 entries back from the seed corn. I could not make out what it had said before it was crossed." The butler was quiet long enough that the kettle on the range behind him began to sing, and he rose to move it off the heat before he answered, as though the ordinary motions of the house could not be neglected even for a thing so old and so carefully buried. "There are names in this house," he said, "that were struck through before you were born, and it was not always kindness that struck them. Was it the old Duchess's hand?" "It was." Then she knew. She knew everything that passed through this house in ledger form, he said, which is not the same as everything that passed through it in truth. She kept accounts, not confessions. He took up the fork again, though his polishing had gone slower, more thoughtful than practical. "If you want the rest of it, you will not find it in a book. Books tell you what was paid. They do not tell you why." "Then who does?" He did not answer that directly, only glanced toward the window, toward the gray stretch of park where, she understood without being told, someone rode most mornings alone, and had done so for longer than a year, and she understood, too, that the butler had said as much as he meant to say for one afternoon, and that the rest, like the code, like the drawers, like the man himself, would have to be earned a little at a time, by patience, by waiting, by being the sort of person to whom such things were, eventually, given. She earned it, as it happened, on the following Tuesday, though not by any design of her own. The Duke came in from his morning ride later than usual, mud to the knee, his coat dark at the shoulders where the drizzle had found him, and he did not go up to change but came instead into the small study, where she sat with the green ledger open before her and a second, smaller book beside it, the wine and cellar accounts, which had not balanced since Michaelmas, and which she had been coaxing into order for the better part of a week. He stood in the doorway a moment before she looked up, and she had the sense, not for the first time, that he watched her at her work, in a way he did not watch anything else in the house, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to study, as though she were a column of figures he had not yet learned to sum. "You have found the error," he said. It was not a question. 6 bottles of the Madeira, entered twice in October and never struck through. Your steward's hand, I think, not your mother's. He was careless with drink, and worse with sums. He came further into the room, dripping faintly onto the worn carpet, and looked down at the page, at her small corrections inked neatly beside the old blotted figures. She would have caught it in a day. She very likely did, said the bookkeeper's daughter, and simply never lived to strike it through. He was quiet at that, the way he was quiet whenever the dowager came into a sentence unbidden, a silence with a particular weight to it, and she had learned by now not to fill it. "You have been talking to the butler," he said at last. "He talks to me, more truly. I only listen. That is a rare talent in this house. Most people wait only for their turn to speak." She said nothing, only turned the small book so the correction faced him properly, and he looked at it a moment longer than the figure required. "There is a christening register," he said abruptly, as though the words cost him something to produce. "In the chapel vestry. My mother kept notes in the margins of it too. Names, dates, small things. No one has opened it since she died." "Do you wish me to?" "I have not decided what I wish," he said, and there was, for the first time she could recall, no coldness at all in it, only the plain admission of a man standing in a doorway with rain still on his coat, uncertain of his own instructions, and she found she did not mind waiting to hear the rest. The rain had not stopped by the time she went to the vestry, and she went alone, for he did not offer to accompany her, and she did not ask it of him. The chapel smelled of tallow and old stone, of dust that had settled undisturbed for longer than a year, and the register lay where it had always lain, on a sloped desk beneath a window, whose glass had gone the color of weak tea with age. She opened it with the caution she gave to anything that had belonged to the dowager, as though the pages themselves might object to her hands. The names went back further than she had expected, christenings, a scatter of burials pressed between them in the same ink, and in the margins, exactly as he had said, small notes in a hand she now knew as well as her own father's. Not figures this time, words. Fussed through the whole right. Godmother wept. Cook sent up plum cake, too dry. A history of the house written sideways to its official one, in the same private shorthand that had governed the ledgers, as if the dowager had never trusted a single fact to stand unadorned by its human weather. She found, near the middle, an entry for a birth 39 years past, and beside it, in smaller letters than the rest, as though written with more care or more feeling. A difficult morning. He came into the world reluctant, and has been reluctant ever since. No name beside it, but she did not need one. She sat with that line a long while, in a cold room, with rain finding its way in through a crack somewhere above the altar, and found she was smiling in a manner she would not have wished observed. She copied nothing. Some things, she had learned, did not belong on a fair copy anywhere. But she carried the sentence back with her across the wet gravel, turning it the way she might have turned a coin, and when she came into the study he was standing exactly where she had left him, as though the hours between had not moved for him at all. "There is nothing that wants correcting," she said, "only a mother's opinion of her son, recorded 39 years too early to be fair." He did not ask what it said. He only watched her set down her wet cloak, and something in his face rearranged itself slightly, the way ice does before it decides to crack, and neither of them spoke again of the register that evening, though it sat between them all the same, an open thing neither was yet prepared to close. The house settled into its ordinary rhythms after that, or seemed to, though ordinary was a word that had come to mean something different at Marlstone than it once had. Doors were oiled. Fires were laid an hour earlier against the coming frost. The old butler took to leaving the study candle-trimmed each evening without being asked, a small mercy neither she nor the Duke remarked upon, though both noticed it burned longer than it once had. It was on the second Tuesday of December, with rain turned to sleet against the east windows, that she sat with the wage-book open beside the green ledger, and did the sum she had avoided doing plainly for some weeks, though she had known its shape for longer than that. £412, set against a housekeeper's wage of £30 the year, less what had already been reckoned from the months prior. She wrote the figures small, in her father's hand, the columns straight as fence rails, and found the debt now stood at £11, 6 shillings and 4 pence. £11. A sum that had once seemed a mountain now sat before her the size of a modest quarter's shopping list, and she stared at it, the way one stares at a door one had not expected to reach so soon. She did not go to him with it. That was not yet the hour for it, though she understood, turning her pen between her fingers, that the hour was no longer distant. The old butler found her still at the desk past 10, the household abed, and glanced at the figures without being invited to, as was his habit now, a privilege earned rather than granted. "Not long," he said. "No. And when it is done—" He did not finish the sentence as a question, and she did not answer it as one, because there was no answer yet that either of them could shape into words, without disturbing something neither wished disturbed before its time. "The house will want a housekeeper still," she said instead, which was true, and also was not the thing either of them meant. He looked at her a moment longer than courtesy required, then bid her good night in the manner of a man closing a ledger he did not intend to reopen that evening, and left her to the candle and the sleet and the £11 6 shillings and fourpence that stood now, so nearly, between her and the door. She sat a while after he had gone, not writing, only watching the wax gutter, and thought, not for the first time, though more plainly than before, that she had begun the year owing a debt to a dead woman's son, and would end it not knowing, with any certainty at all, which of them had come to owe the greater. Morning brought no answer to the question she had not asked, only the ordinary weight of work, which she had come to think of as its own kind of mercy. The £11, 6 shillings and fourpence sat in the ledger like a tide mark, and she watched it recede through the last cold weeks of the year, the way a woman watches a wound close, slowly, and with more attention than the healing strictly required. The butler brought her, one morning in late November, a small tin box he had kept, he said, since the old Duchess's time, containing receipts for candles going back 11 years, in case the new accounting had need of them. It had no need of them. She thanked him as though it had, and he seemed satisfied, and did not mention that he had watched her hands more than her figures while she said it. There were smaller victories that month, the kind no one else would think to count. A dispute with the miller over weight of flour, settled by her own scale, kept apart from the households and calibrated, she told him plainly, against his cheating, rather than for his convenience. A maid caught weeping over a debt of her own, 4 shillings to a draper in Aldrich, quietly discharged from the housekeeping fund, with a note in the ledger reading only, "Sundry, authorized." The old Duchess's own phrase for kindnesses she had not wished her son to trace. He found that entry once, turning pages he no longer needed to turn, and said nothing of it, though he looked at the maid the next morning with an attention that made the girl blush and curtsy twice. December came in on a wind that stripped the last leaves from the lime avenue and left the house sounding, at night, like something breathing through its walls. She worked by 2 candles now instead of 1, a small extravagance she had not asked for and he had not commented on, though the second candle appeared, unremarked, the week after the first frost, and she understood it for what it was, without either of them naming it. The debt stood, by her own careful reckoning, at £4 and some odd shillings, a sum so near to nothing that she found herself avoiding the final calculation, the way one avoids the last page of a book one does not wish to end. The green ledger lay closed beside her, its clasp worn smooth by 2 women's hands now, and outside the window the first hard snow of the year began, quietly, to cover the drive, the stables, and the long approach up which, 8 months before, she had walked as a stranger, owing a debt she had not made. She finished the calculation on the 22nd day of December, sitting alone in the small office off the servants' hall. The fire burned down to its last red architecture, and found the figure smaller than she had allowed herself to hope, £3, 11 shillings and fourpence. She wrote it in the margin of her own private accounting, not the green ledger, in pencil, and looked at it for a long while without moving. The butler found her there an hour later, still looking. "You have finished, then," he said. It was not quite a question. He had known, she understood, for some days, had watched her arithmetic the way he watched weather, reading the coming season in small signs before anyone announced it. "Nearly," she said. "A month, perhaps 6 weeks, at the wage agreed." He set down the tray he had carried in out of habit rather than instruction, tea she had not asked for, in the second-best china, which was itself a kind of announcement, and said nothing further, though he stood a moment longer than the errand required, as men do when they have something to say and have decided, on reflection, not to say it. She did not tell the Duke. It was not concealment, so much as reluctance. The reluctance of a woman standing at the top of a stair she has climbed for 8 months, unwilling yet to look down and see how far she has come, because looking down is also a way of seeing how little farther there is left to climb. He asked her, 3 days before Christmas, whether the accounts for the coming year should be drawn up in the old form or a new one. "The old form," she said, "your mother's form. There is no reason to change what answers." "No," he agreed, and something in his voice suggested he was no longer speaking only of the ledger. He stood near the window, his hands behind his back, watching the snow thicken on the drive, with the particular stillness of a man deliberately not asking a question he has already half formed. No reason at all. She bent again over the green ledger, ruling a fresh line beneath the December entries, and did not see, though the butler, passing the open door with an armful of holly for the hall, saw it plainly enough, the way the Duke's gaze moved from the window to her bent head and stayed there, unhurried, as a man looks at something he has stopped pretending he does not wish to keep. Outside, the snow went on falling, indifferent to debts and to the small, careful arithmetic by which a woman had made herself, without ever once asking for it, indispensable to a house that had not known, until her coming, how badly it had needed mending. The holly, once distributed along the mantelpieces and the newel post in the old dowager's fashion, a habit no one else in the house had troubled to remember, save the butler, brought a green smell into rooms that had smelled only of cold wax and dust for a 12-month. She noticed it without remark, as she had learned to notice most things in that house without remark, and entered it nonetheless into the ledger's margin, beside the December total, in the small annotation the old dowager had once used for household observances, a single looped mark, half a wreath, that meant nothing to anyone but the woman who had invented it and the woman who had since learned to read her. The butler found her at the desk past 10 that evening, the candle burned to a stub, and said nothing of the hour, only set down a fresh one and took the old. £406, 4 shillings, she said, not looking up. By my reckoning, against the housekeeper's wage. And the remainder, miss? £6, 16 shillings. She turned the page, squared its corner with her thumbnail, an old habit of her father's she had never troubled to lose. A fortnight's work, perhaps less, if the accounts continue as they have. He did not ask what she meant to do when the fortnight had passed, and the sum stood at nothing. He had served in that house 41 years, long enough to know that some questions were better left in the ledger and not in the mouth. She had thought of it herself, of course, in the quiet hours when the house slept and the fire had gone to coals, of the room she would take in Aldrich, small and dry, above the chandler's, where a woman of her training might find work keeping accounts for the wool merchants, of the debt paper, folded now in the strong-box upstairs, that would soon bear no further claim on her, of the particular silence that would follow her out through the gates once there was nothing left to owe. She had thought of it the way one thinks of weather still some days off, certain, unhurried, not yet requiring a coat. What she had not permitted herself to think of, in any careful or costed way, was the study itself in her absence, the 2 chairs drawn near the fire, the green ledger closed and returned to its drawer, the Duke's hand reaching for a code he had never learned to read, without her beside him to translate it. She ruled her line, blotted it, and set the pen down straight along the desk's edge, exactly as she had found it that first morning, a small, deliberate tidiness, as if to prove to herself that she meant to leave everything in this house precisely as ordered as she had found it wanting. The Duke came to the study a little before 9, as he had come every evening for the better part of a year, and found her at the desk with her cloak already brushed, and folded over the chair back nearest the door, a small, terrible sign, that folding, more final than any words she might have chosen. He did not sit. He crossed instead to the drawer where the green ledger lived, drew it out, and set it before her open to the last written page. She saw her own hand there beside the dowager's, the final line ruled and blotted an hour before, the account closed to the farthing, £412, discharged in full, in labor and patience and a year of winters, with nothing more owing on either side. "It balances," he said, "not a question." "It does," she said. He was quiet a moment, looking not at the figures, but at the 2 hands set side by side on the page, the old ink and the new, one dead a year that very evening, one still faintly warm. Then he reached into his waistcoat and drew out a small brass key on a worn ribbon, the ledger key, the one that had hung always at his mother's belt and, since her death, in a locked drawer no one else had touched, not the butler, not the housekeeper, not even himself in any usable way. He held it out to her across the desk, not as a man bestowing a gift, but as one relinquishing a thing too heavy to carry alone any longer. She did not take it at once. "I have paid what was owed," she said. "There is nothing further to bind me here." "No," he agreed. "There is not." He did not lower his hand. "The house keeps its own hours now. I find I do not wish to learn them without you." It was not a request, and it was not quite a confession, and it was, in its way, the only sentence he had ever spoken to her that cost him more than his pride. She looked at the key a long moment, small, unremarkable, the sort of thing a careless man might lose down the back of a drawer and never miss. And then she took it, and closed her fingers over it, and said nothing at all, which was answer enough for a house that had learned to read silences better than speech. The cloak stayed folded over the chair another 12 months before it was finally put away for good. And though no one in the household ever spoke of it directly, the housemaids came to notice, banking the fires each night that winter, and the winters after, that the study candle no longer burned down alone past midnight in one chair, but in two, steady, companionable, unremarked, as if the house itself had simply resumed an old and settled habit it had never truly